Let's look at a case study of an example of a paired samples t-test. The researchers' interest in this topic developed through repeated exposure to students who sought tutoring support for writing, yet expressed uncertainty about whether their efforts were truly making a difference. In instructional and academic support settings, students often report feeling more confident after tutoring, but confidence does not always align with measurable improvement in writing performance. At the same time, institutions continue to invest substantial resources in tutoring programs based on the assumption that these services improve student outcomes. This tension between perceived benefit and demonstrable improvement prompted a deeper interest in how writing growth is evaluated and whether common approaches truly capture student change. This interest led to a closer examination of the existing literature on tutoring and writing development. Although tutoring programs are widely used to support student writing, findings regarding their effectiveness remain inconsistent. Some studies report gains in writing performance following tutoring participation, while others find minimal or no improvement. A closer look at this literature suggests that these mixed findings are often connected to how improvement is defined and measured. Much of the existing research evaluates tutoring effectiveness by comparing different groups of students, such as those who participated in tutoring and those who did not. While these group comparisons can be informative, they do not directly address whether individual students improve over time. When students begin tutoring with different baseline writing abilities, group comparisons can obscure meaningful within-student change. As a result, the literature lacks sufficient evidence addressing a more focused question. Do students demonstrate measurable improvement in writing performance when they are compared to themselves across time? This gap in the literature points to the need for a research approach that examines change within individuals rather than differences between groups. Because the gap centers on measurable change in writing scores, the problem is inherently quantitative in nature. The outcome of interest, writing performance, is numeric, and the goal is to determine whether observed changes are large enough to be unlikely due to chance. This focus aligns with a quantitative approach, which is designed to evaluate patterns in numeric data, rather than a qualitative approach, which would be better suited for exploring students' experiences or perceptions of tutoring. Once the decision to use a quantitative approach is established, the next consideration is the specific type of quantitative question required by the literature gap. The gap does not ask whether writing scores can be predicted from other variables, which would call for regression analysis. It does not ask whether writing scores are related to another continuous variable, which would suggest correlation. It also does not ask whether different groups of students have different writing scores, which would require a group comparison analysis such as an independent samples t-test or ANOVA. Instead, the gap asks whether the same students show meaningful change in writing performance over time. This focus on change directs the study toward a difference question rather than a prediction or association question. The structure of the data further clarifies the analytic choice. Each student contributes 2 writing scores, one collected before tutoring participation and one collected after. These 2 scores are related because they come from the same individual. This pairing is central to the logic of the study, as each student serves as their own point of comparison. Analyses designed for independent groups would ignore this dependency and potentially misrepresent the amount of change that occurred. Taken together, these considerations lead directly to the selection of a paired samples t-test. This analysis is specifically designed to evaluate whether the average change between 2 related measurements is statistically significant. It allows the study to focus on within-student improvement while accounting for the paired nature of the data. Based on this reasoning, the purpose of this quantitative study was to examine whether students' writing performance changed after participation in a tutoring intervention. Using a within-subjects, pretest, posttest design, the study employed a paired samples t-test to determine whether there was a statistically significant difference in mean writing scores for the same students before and after tutoring participation. Guided by this purpose, the study addressed the following research question: is there a statistically significant difference in mean writing scores for the same students before and after participation in a tutoring intervention? The null hypothesis was therefore that there is no statistically significant difference in the mean writing scores of students before and after participation in a tutoring intervention. The alternative hypothesis was that there is a statistically significant difference in the mean writing scores of students before and after participation in a tutoring intervention. The sample consisted of 40 students who completed the same standardized writing assessment prior to beginning the tutoring intervention, and again after completing the intervention. Writing scores were derived using a consistent scoring rubric at both time points. Prior to tutoring, the mean writing score was 72.4 with a standard deviation of 10.1. Following tutoring, the mean writing score increased to 78.9 with a standard deviation of 9.4. These descriptive statistics indicate that, on average, students scored higher after tutoring. However, descriptive statistics alone do not indicate whether this improvement reflects more than random fluctuation. The paired samples t-test provided a formal test of whether this observed improvement was statistically meaningful. The results indicated a statistically significant difference in writing scores from before the intervention to after the intervention, with a t-value of 3.12 for 39 degrees of freedom, and a p-value of 0.003. This finding indicates that the pattern of improvement observed across students is unlikely to be due to chance alone. In practical terms, this means that the increase in writing scores was consistent enough across participants to support the conclusion that real change occurred. Rejecting the null hypothesis in this context directly answers the research question. The analysis supports the conclusion that students' writing performance differed significantly after tutoring participation, when compared to their own baseline performance. This finding directly addresses the gap identified in the literature by providing evidence of within-student improvement rather than relying on comparisons between different groups of students. While statistical significance establishes that change occurred, it does not indicate how large or meaningful that change was. To address this issue, effect size was examined using Cohen's d. The effect size value of 0.49 represents a moderate effect, suggesting that the improvement in writing performance was not merely detectable but educationally meaningful. This indicates that the change in scores reflects a substantive improvement, rather than a minimal shift that reached significance due to sample size alone. The practical meaning of this improvement is further clarified by the confidence interval for the mean difference. The 95% confidence interval ranged from 2.2 to 10.8 points. This range indicates that the typical student experienced an improvement somewhere between approximately 2 and 11 points on the writing assessment. Framing the results in this way helps translate statistical findings into concrete terms that are meaningful for educators and program evaluators. The trustworthiness of these findings is strengthened by alignment among the research problem, literature gap, purpose statement, research question, and analytic approach. Each component of the study builds logically on the previous one, reducing the likelihood that the findings are artifacts of poor design or inappropriate analysis. Additionally, the interpretation integrates multiple indicators of evidence, including statistical significance, effect size, and confidence intervals, rather than relying on a single metric. At the same time, the findings must be interpreted within the limits of the study design. Although students demonstrated improvement following tutoring participation, the paired samples t-test does not establish causation. Without a comparison group, it is not possible to rule out alternative explanations for the observed improvement, such as maturation, increased familiarity with the writing assessment, or other instructional experiences occurring during the same period. Considerations of power and robustness further contextualize the results. With a sample size of 40 students, the study had sufficient power to detect a moderate effect, as reflected in the statistically significant finding. However, smaller effects may not have been detected. The paired samples t-test is generally robust to modest deviations from normality, but extreme outliers in change scores could influence the mean difference. There was no indication that the results were driven by a small number of extreme cases, though this remains an important consideration in interpreting average change. Because the study involved only 2 related measurements, no post hoc tests were required. Post hoc analyses are relevant when multiple comparisons are made, which was not the case here. If additional time points had been included, a different analytic approach would have been necessary. In summary, this quantitative study addressed a clear gap in the literature by examining within-student change in writing performance following tutoring participation. The use of a paired samples t-test aligned with the research question, and design allowed for a focused examination of change over time. The findings indicate a statistically significant and moderately sized improvement in writing scores, providing evidence that students demonstrated meaningful improvement following tutoring participation. While causal conclusions cannot be drawn, the results contribute insight into how tutoring outcomes can be evaluated using designs that center individual change rather than group comparison.